COIN, Community-Oriented Integration Network, is a network of friends, people of experience, who explore how to develop local communities for health, compassionate communities.
I'm Linda Lang. I'm chairing the meeting this evening. I'm a member of COIN. My background is in education, and we're going to be touching on education. Several of the speakers this evening will be touching on education, and this is an area of particular interest of mine.
Hi, I'm John Emmett. So yeah, my background's voluntary sector at the moment. I'm director of a care association and doing various other bits and bobs of consulting.
Linda, thank you. My name is Duke Tran, and I'm a transformation program manager in Brent Council, which is a West London council.
John Spicer, GP in Croydon and a teacher of medical law and ethics in various places.
Hi, Elaine Brands. I'm English. I worked for a long time in health strategy with Chris Brophy. I'm doing a lot of work I come from a social change, social innovation, social entrepreneurship history with Chris, and then really now using a lot of foresight and futures thinking to help communities change their narratives and different sectors do contracts with the UN and various other things.
Hi everyone, I'm in southern Denmark at the moment. I'm a medical doctor and a PhD student, and I work predominantly with risk prediction and communication in general practice.
I'm a Londoner transplanted to the States, a primary care want-to-be, and I'm known for making sure that we include other living creatures, including trees, in our conversations.
Hello,
thank you.
Yes, I'm Tony, another retired GP and educator, but now I'm involved in AGK London, age-friendly boroughs, particularly mine in Brent, but very interested in how primary care is going, and particularly, of course, on how older people are able to access and use primary care.
Yeah, no, a lawyer with a background in health and care.
And Steve has been a member of COIN for many years and is editor of Health Matters, has been involved in enabling COIN to send out blogs and other information across the internet. Thanks, Steve, for all that you've done. And you're going to talk this evening about education, which is the main focus of this evening. We're starting with you, Steve, so over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for inviting me to come along. I want to talk about a number of topics that you loosely can put together under the heading Integration in the Health Factory. The Health Factory is a medical centre in northwest London, and it's called the Health Factory because one of the local residents decided it should be. The people who worked in it at the time were thinking that they would describe themselves as local medical practitioners, bog standard GPs, if you like. But the health factory message came across quite clearly that the name of the place should reflect what it does and the way that it does it. You will tell me later on whether you think it does do that. If you just move to the next slide. Thank you. One of the things that I was taught very early on as an undergraduate and in the subsequent early years of training was that the NHS was an organisation without a memory. And I'm sure this is wrong. That if you look around the things that you're doing, there is a memory about those things. It may be wrong, of course. It may be rather peculiar. It may be eccentric, but I think it is true that it's there, and we need to think about it as we're carrying on our everyday, ordinary practice, ordinary work. Again, you might have views on this, but perhaps later on we can see if others agree with the organisation with or without memory. Let's move on a slide. Here's general practice as it should be: brick terrace, Victorian, two to three story, rather cute. If you try to work inside it, it's another matter, rather cramped, but elegant to look at. So Chris Ford is a GP working in a health factory, decided we would write the history as best we could of the organisation, and that would include having this period of time, quite a long period of time, in which the practice attempted to function in a hamster cage way. Everything was very busy and very full and very unsatisfactory, but get on with it because there isn't an alternative. So Chris Ford and I are writing, have written, it's one of those two things, about the growth of the practice over a 30-year period, and the description of what happens or doesn't happen in that period of time when you make a move from the rather elegant frontage of the house to the ugly factory. The first few weeks we were working in the factory, sparks came out the window on the opposite side of the road. You couldn't park your car too near that if it was a recurrence. Big trucks would roll up and things would be taken away. And in the end, we were left with a pleasingly large, gratifying, but rather cold and echoey big set of rooms. I'll show you more about what we do in those. The text at the bottom there, PM drops in on the health factory. A PM is a prime minister, and it's true. He did. Just after he was elected, when he no longer desperately needed support, he'd got it already. But he was pleased, and he was clearly engaged in a very detailed way with what was going on inside this big health factory building. Can I have the next slide, please? So in the beginning, there's a problem in medicine, which is connected in part to the technologies available to it, and in part, I think, to the social organization of it. So in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, is when I came into this work, and Chris Ford as well, of course. In that period of time, the Lancet described eloquently how medical students in modern society were bored to death, and how clinical skills were not being acquired. There's a cohort of new doctors being produced by the old teaching hospitals, and those doctors were not able to examine people adequately or to make suggestions that were practical about the outcome of some intervention or another. Medical students often learn despite their teaching rather than from it. I can remember that very clearly as well. And then came the solution to the NHS's problems, which is that teaching should move into the community. If only that would happen, things would be entirely different. But they haven't happened yet. We of course were in the business of trying out some options for that. If you move along one, please, Lucy. The attempts to make general practice into the more dynamic element of medical training had an early origin in that the College of GPs appears in 1952. And I think I'm right in saying 1972 was when they were given the crown and became a royal organisation. Is that right? Is there anybody who knows the history? Anyway, no matter. This organisation formed, lots of members got more numerous, became more and more noisy. It's the RCGP that we know and love. There were also some people who were dynamic characters who were able to talk about the work that they were doing, medical practice, and the training for it, undergraduate and postgraduate training for it, in the context of their setting, their everyday life. So if you've not been able to get hold of a copy of John Berger's Fortunate Man, well, you're losing out, because it's a triumph of a book. Nobody much remembers Polly Moyland, who was the John Berger of the similar area, but was much less in the public eye, let's say. And in Holland, a professor of general practice called Huygens took a sketchbook with him on all house calls so that he could draw what he saw. What he saw might be a depressed kitchen, so he could draw a depressed kitchen, show it to you, and you would say, that's a depressed kitchen. Worth looking for his book if you get the chance. And then, of course, Julian Tudor-Hart, who is a GP working in the Welsh mining villages of South Wales. And he was a dynamo and a proselytizer for general practice being the solution for the problems of medicine and medical practice. If you haven't seen him, you would be astonished to have an encounter with him. He would come face to face with a great deal of passion. What everybody more or less agreed with, I think, is that this business of teaching people in the community was a multi-year journey. It was a long march. You had to accept that from the beginning, and then you wouldn't be so distressed by it when it got attenuated, got drawn out. Can I have the next slide, please? Bottom right-hand quarter, autocatalytic. I'm going to come back to that. What would you need if you were sitting where the factory people were sitting? What would you need to make your workplace more effective as a producer of knowledge and an applier of knowledge? And we talked, or rather this practice talked about shared developmental spaces. No, it's not physical place alone, but what goes on in the space. That is, the development of individuals occurs within the space, and that space is shared in a way you may not be accustomed to. Appreciating other people's perspectives and making sense of data in the light of lived experience were things that were important because medicine recruits from a very selective social base. That needs to be challenged in practice, but also the practitioners need to be helped through the problem in Northwest London of racism. But diverge a bit into a million change agents. Can anybody who knows anything about the million change agents put their hand up? I've seen myself. Well, here I am. Can you see my? There's my hand. I've got a hand. Anybody else? 2004, NHS supported towards a million change agents was the presentation of the ideas of the health service for its renewal and rejuvenation in the social movement terms, the language of social movements. That they came up with this autocatalytic stuff, which I really like because it makes you sound much greater than you really are out there. But self-fueling, the theory being that everybody could work as a mobilizer. There's something about making every contact work in this, which is perhaps the up-to-date version of it. But this was in 2004. It didn't last very long. It lasted to 2005, I think. And certainly no million change agents emerged. But the idea was there. This is what you have in front of you is not just the factory that's about health. It is also the place where the change agents go to and come from.
Yeah, quite a lot was happening in Steve. Quite a lot was happening in 2004, wasn't it? There's, I mean, community interest companies first came into being in 2004. Interestingly, with the Companies Act 2004, and I think foundation trusts came into being around then, sort of properly. You know, with both of them having sort of different structures and involving different sorts of members and so on. And you know, I know Elaine is kind of quite big, maybe just generally on the concept of change agents. So she might want to say something later, but yeah, there was a lot happening around that period about just generally in terms of kind of some new things, I think.
I think, and I'll show you the reasons for thinking it, that it's a period of transformation, whatever bit you're looking at or from. Here's a turning point in the health service and in social care. So I take your point. Were they also catalytic? This is what you must always ask. Am I or am I not also catalytic? Can we have the next slide, please? So if you come to the health factory on a Monday morning and met one of the participants, one of the organisers, who take you in, they open the door and lead you in. And this is what you see. And I just want to go through this with a little bit of detail. Lonsdale partners are the people who carry the can. The money organisers are also clinicians, very hard-working ones. But they don't necessarily see themselves as primary change agents. On the other hand, the medicine in the community firm, that's 6 students learning in the practice for 6 weeks at a time, and then another firm comes and does the same again. Intense activity, intense training for students in the early part of their postgraduate, oh, heaven's sake, I've lost the words. You know what I mean. There are GP registrars to do with professional training, and there are sessional GPs who need to do a bit of work, but they haven't got much time, and so they're limited. There are clinical medical students, there are returner doctors who've gone away for a bit, and then they come back to rejoin general practice and need a bit of retraining to do that. The counsellors and practice nurses and community nurses and social work students as well. So they're the people in the room. We're going to share experiences. You've got some experience to share in this crowd. Move this along one, please. Lucia. I have to get near peer learning in because I don't really think I know that much about it, but it sounds like a good idea. And as far as I can see, what it means is that the person that you're standing to knows a little bit more than you do, or perhaps it's a little bit more than you do, a little bit less than you do, and changes that situation so that you come away from the encounter knowing something that you didn't know before, or perhaps having an idea corrected when it's been false. GP trainers and trainees do this quite a lot. In the old days of hospital firms, I think there was quite a lot of near-peer learning, but that seems to not fade away completely, but thin down quite a lot. And the next one, please. The evaluation of the health factory has been very positive all the way through, independent of the role of the staff there, looking for crowns, basically. The centre got beacon status in whenever that was, 2006, I think. And beacon status was awarded to half a dozen practices across the country that were exemplars of medical undergraduate and postgraduate training. It wasn't terribly successful as a way of stimulating education. The practices didn't communicate with each other very well, but they were there and they could fly their banner. And educational tutors from the university and from the medical schools were suitably impressed. Next slide, please. But, and here is 2004, that Chris mentioned, things start to go wrong. The point of this chart is that on the left is the beginning of 2004 and on the right is the end of 2004. And the arrows in between it occur in areas where there is activity, human activity of some sort or other, which can be be quantified and predicted and put in almost into a simple model of working, so that those who were in the process, in the building, in the work program in 2004 knew that they had a problem and they could specify that problem in terms of staffing and skills and resources. And that this is just one brief way of doing that with a left to right movement, an area of cash flow turbulence. When is there not an area of cash flow turbulence in general practice? And disruption to teaching. And I think if you go to the next slide, that might be there. This business of integration, which I appreciate I've hardly touched on, is a big and complicated problem. There are lots of ways to try and talk about it, and this is just one of them that I did with a couple of colleagues. The oneness report and the anti-vaxxers. And I think I'm going to stop there and say, if you want a copy of the 100-page book on the Health Factory, happy to send you a PDF of it. If you want a printed version, it's about £4.50 a booklet. You can buy it yourself. The anti-vaxxers have gone away, but that's not a bad idea. Don Berwick, who people will know very well, is a source of good ideas. In the turbulent period of 2004, when things were becoming unstable, I think what he has to say is stabilizing things. He's stopping the machine agitating too much by listing a series of attributes which you see there that will protect people from the disadvantages of the system, including the disadvantages of having a health factory as opposed to a cuddly practice.
What's happened to it since? Has it changed much? Has it progressed?
It's acquired a cafe.
Ooh.
And a prayer room.
Wow.
As well as hanging on to some of the clinical work of the area and dealing with the new approach to general practice.
To give a shout out really to the work of Michael Medell and Elizabeth Murray, who were professors at UCL and really set out the first properly studied provision for undergraduate medical teaching in the community. Michael had been doing this since the 1990s, and Elizabeth joined him. I think she was his PhD student, and did a PhD in the subject, and then went on to become professor of primary care itself at UCL, where she then went on to lead the e-health unit. She was also a partner at Lonsdale Medical Practice as well, that Steve mentioned. So it was really just to say that in terms of undergraduate education, the work of the UCL team was groundbreaking, and the contributions of both Michael Medell and Elizabeth Murray were clearly to change the way undergraduate education in the UK is delivered, in that it gave strength to the argument that actually undertaking education in the community is just as good, if not better, than being taught in secondary care. I just wanted to just flag and acknowledge the importance of their work alongside Steve's in really trying to shift education to a much better place, which is obviously in the community.
Indeed, thank you. That's really important to.
Sorry, Steve. That's great. Elizabeth Murray was instrumental behind the undergraduate teaching, and Mike Medell, poor man, had responsibility for the money. So you can imagine how things might have gone in 2004 if those destabilizing trends have continued.
I can't remember what the destabilizing factors were in 2004. I'm sorry. What were the particular issues that?
The new GP contract, basically.
Ah, of course.
Everybody slamming all the doors shut and saying, we haven't got money left.
Thank you. That's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know how all the retired GPs and current GPs, on the call think, but GP contracts have always been kind of tough, haven't they? I don't know how, it's really funny. You kind of almost spend as long, the lawyers and stuff with the Red Book and, GP contracts, PMS, GMS, as you would on a PFI contract. I think sometimes almost, it just seemed to be, quite a complex affair, didn't it, for doing, something which one would have thought could have been done simpler, but I think it's always been the case. But it can't have made, managing and keeping a track of all that. And as Steve hinted at, Steve, did you think money sort of took over a bit? There's something on your slide where you talked about trust and so on.
Yes, I mean I suppose it's always a problem, isn't it, of people taking advantage of situations, really. I always think about the legal and financial bit in 2004 onwards as being evidence that there is organisation with a memory. It's just a bad memory.
Which is worse in some ways. Yeah. Negative, has a negative impact.
I'm a nurse, health visitor, and was up until recently, for the last 13 years, I was the chief executive of the Queen's Institute of Community Nursing. And I've moved to what I'm calling preferment rather than retirement, because I am not stopping doing things. And
I'm a family doctor. I'm from the UK originally, and I trained and worked in the UK as a GP, but I've spent the last 11 years in Canada, so I'm in Ontario at the moment. And I'm the medical lead for an organisation. I work in a rural part of Ontario, and we have real problems with access and access to primary care and attachment to family doctors and family health teams. And so I lead a program called Integrated Virtual Care, where we try and blend doctors working remotely with community resources in the local communities to mesh together a blended version, a hybrid version of primary care.
So Steve's talked a lot about what's happened in the past and how it's progressed through, and the breakthroughs into community medicine and involving people across various disciplines as well within community environments. So that's for where we've got to with Steve. So over to you, Paul.
I first want to respond to Steve. I think it was great that Sanjeev sort of reminded you, Steve, of just how radical and ahead of the field you were. Yes, you had the Prime Minister opening your health factory, and you were one of the beacon practices. But in 1989, when I was in Liverpool, there in a city of 500,000 people, there were only 6 practice nurses. So I think we just need to reflect how this is traveling at lightning speed. I mean, what you were doing in 1978 was way ahead of everywhere else. I was in Princes Park Health Centre in Liverpool in Toxteth, which was another one of these places you're describing that was ahead of other places. But generally speaking, multidisciplinary team working, organisational development, community development for general practice the language has been there forever, but it's only become a reality relatively recently. And I think that we need to also understand, especially having gone through the markets and targets and Thatcher and conservative things, and talking about the UK, Jonathan and other people from other places, has meant that the whole idea that health is nothing more than a set of diagnoses and all you've got to do is treat the diagnosis and the world get better is such a fatuous understanding about how the world works. And yet it is nevertheless the idea that it underpins policy and people's thinking. I heard, how do you get people to work together, to see health as well as disease, to systematically develop communities, to avoid people trying to take everything on and being burned out? The general practice, primary care, has not yet discovered the theory of what it is to be a generalist. How to align medical treatments in the context of the health of a community, how to link public health boundaries and primary care boundaries and primary care networks in the UK don't even connect. I mean, when you're at such a unable to get past page 1, it's hardly surprising we haven't got even catching up with where Steve was at sort of 30 years ago. So I want to make an appeal for case studies and role play as a regular method of education at all stages of development, from schools and primary schools and pre-primary schools to medical education to postgraduate education, to every single space. And here's why. If you have spent your entire life imagining that the world is nothing more than a set of discrete facts, and all you've got to do is identify them and deal with them, you've made something happen. You've misunderstood how the world works. The facts of what life was, if you look over your shoulder and what has been established as inverted commas truth from the past, or that's a discussion for another day, it's absolutely different from the complex and interactive mechanism of people moving forward. Moving forward in life, everything is reacting to changes in everything else. It is like a garden. You know, the bees and the trees and the birds and the grasses and everything else is interacting with each other. And what happens comes out of that in a complex learning process. And on top of that, you've got the seasons anyway. You know, I mean, I've got a little back garden here, which I love. And, you know, some days it's full of red roses and the next day it's full of white roses. Well, that's just how things happen. It's not that I've got a red rose garden or a white rose garden, because on different days and in different seasons, it's different. And that's the reality of looking forward. Now, historically, my view is that GPs of experience who are mostly male, mostly single-handed, mostly isolated from anything else to do with education in the healthcare service, I'm still talking about the UK, found these things out through instinct. So they developed family and community-oriented practice out of just what seemed to work, not through theory. But then as practices got bigger, and we've heard from Steve already how they became units and organizations and primary care teams and whatever, the theory about how you do that never followed. I think that is all there now. We can do it. We've been talking about it a lot at these meetings. One thing that happens is that the moment you move back into the chaos of life, you kind of very quickly forget it. And you very quickly focus on the things in front of you and react to the problems of the day because there's so many of them. And you have to stand back and look at the complexity of everything in life. And then you very quickly forget that because something else takes over. So if you like that, if you agree with that, it means that people at every stages of life need to repeatedly experience, formally and informally, and understand what they're doing, the reality of the complex co-adaptive nature of life. Now, this happens naturally, you know, church services, football grounds, youth groups, whatever, but they call it normal life and living. What few people seem to have noticed that these are repeated opportunities for people to creatively interact with each other, and they are there modeling what we need to be happening everywhere. When my wife was dying, we used that kind of thinking, although even at that time, with all the 30 years I've been looking at this, I hadn't quite understood what we were doing. By having an open house and people coming, going forward and having parties and things, it meant that we were modelling what happens in, let's say, a football ground and needs to be happening in general practice. People coming backwards and forward and seeing what happens from different perspectives as things evolve. Now, 2 schools were involved in that, and my own children's friends and their families got involved in that. So they were able to understand quite quickly that there's different points of view, and this is more complex than you thought at first sight, and you can learn by experience. Well, I'm thinking it worked really well. About 100 people were involved. If you could institutionalize that kind of exposure to complex realities, you've got the basis of people understanding what we're talking about and escaping from the narrow definition of diagnosis and cure of medical conditions. So I want to propose case studies. We should make neighbourhoods case studies of healthcare delivery, where their strategies for collaboration are described as case studies, and they exhibit the global effect, the neighbourhood-wide effects of their collaborative efforts through things like the emergency hospital admissions, like place of death, like other things that are unique and relevant to that particular case study to show that complex collaborations can make this kind of thing work. Whereas tracking individual activities through the complexity of life is a waste of time and very misleading. So too at schools. Why not say that every one of my sons became unwell. He developed epilepsy, and the teachers got his friendship group to understand what you do if somebody has a fit. Well, I think that's absolutely brilliant. Why can't all schools use whatever happening in a friendship group difficulties as an opportunity for them to understand something about the complexity of life and building friendships and teams through those kind of things? Music can do this. You know, people can learn that when they learn music at school, it's not just because it's a nice thing to do, although it is, but you're learning teamwork. If you drum with somebody else and you're drumming out of beat, you've got to learn to drum in beat. Even if it's cleverly outbeated inside the beat, you're still together with each other. And some beats sound good together and some don't. So the process of engaging in a shared project, in this case, beating a drum or managing epilepsy or somebody who's dying and who've got difficulties at home, starts being an opportunity for people to learn the skills and techniques and theory of community development. Communities being a network of relationships that is developed through creative interaction. What about medical schools requiring or expecting or advising people going into medicine or nursing or other social work or whatever, saying, we really strongly advise you to take a gap year. And in that year, we really would love to support you in some minute way, because we don't have much resources, to do some kind of study of something that's outside your usual experience, where you experience things from different directions. Well, I know from my own teaching that you can do this in moments with people. I used to get people who were applying for research grants to role play the adjudicating panel for other people's projects. So the students who were applying for a grant would then, in the role play, become the assessors of whether or not somebody else's research project was worth funding. And very quickly they got to see, actually, no, the funding bodies have got a point. They really do have to, they're not just deciding not to fund you because you're rubbish. It's because you haven't thought it through and you haven't explained it, whatever. And you can learn that in a couple of hours in a workshop. Why doesn't that infuse all of education in medical school, in postgraduate education, and particularly in general practice? As long as general practice still doesn't understand the theory of generalism, community development, health as well as disease, then it's still talking the wrong language to understand the future.
Thank you in particular to the two speakers that have gone before me, because I think they've stimulated some really interesting thoughts of my own that I'd like to share. I come at this conversation through the lens of community-oriented care, and the first thing I'd like to say is that at a place like a medical school or indeed any other health professions institute of learning, for me, amongst the most important thing is to see whether we can encourage local people to learn locally. And I think that's a really important place to start. At the moment, we have effectively a very national system of recruitment certainly into medicine. And how we choose to get people from the local community to stay locally, where they have their social networks, where they have made up their social capital over a lifetime. And by that I mean their family friendship networks, their work and other types of networks, is a really important part, I think, of success in education. But the other thing I think is really important as well is how do we ensure that that the makeup of healthcare professionals that come to universities is actually representative of the same population that they from which we draw those applications. And that, I think, is both a challenge and an opportunity that I see as we move forward. Certainly at Anglia Ruskin, we've now got 60 to 70% of our applicants are coming from the Eastern region, and 30% of our students are from a widening participation background. But also, it strikes me that about 10% come from private school, and so we're beginning to try and make representations from the source of where people are coming from. But I don't think it's enough to just think about the mix of people that we bring into the university. I think we also need to think a little bit about the curriculum as well, and the curriculum needs to really reflect the makeup of the local population and the needs of the local population. So, as an example, we're doing a piece of work looking at how we embed public health over biomedical science, as one example. And I know that Louise has been helping ARU actually in bringing creative inquiry into the curriculum itself. So we do have opportunities to try and encourage that deeper, reflective, narrative, critical and artistic perspective within the curriculum, which I think is actually all vital to creating rounded individuals, not just biomedical scientists with application expertise. But beyond that, I think there is also a really important thing for us to think about. How do we prepare people for a life of work as well as a life of craft? And I don't think that, certainly my experience of working at a medical school, we've done enough yet to ensure that we encourage individuals to think a little bit about work, working as an employee, working as a team member, working alongside other professional groups, working in a society and understanding one's obligations to that society as well. And I think that's an important part of the journey that I think we need to undertake. But beyond that, I think it's also about then how do we encourage, having brought local people in, having taught them, having shared with them opportunities for really thinking about the needs of the local people in the context of the curriculum. It also then becomes really important to think a little bit about how do we encourage people to stay locally as well for their clinical careers. And that again is where I think systemic issues like national recruitment processes really fail us in medicine. And I think there is an important role for medical schools to challenge some of that. And certainly that's what we've been doing at Anglia Ruskin, is bucking the trend by creating separate processes for students to choose to stay locally should they want to. And I'm delighted to say that roughly 60% of our students choose to stay in Essex, which has historically been an under-doctored area.
Yeah.
And the success of that, in my opinion, is the collaboration with employers. Without the relationship with employers, we would not begin to understand what the nature of work needs to look like. But more importantly, we can't influence them to really reshape the way they think about their systems, their processes, their policies, to enhance the experience of learning for their learners and for their educators. So that, in a nutshell, is what I think we're trying to achieve within Anglia Ruskin. And there are some principles that also underpin this work, and I want to just elaborate on those, if I may, Linda. One of them is shifting the dial around clinical education, and I am being very broad and perhaps a little provocative by saying that actually I think that we focus too much on the requirement for attendance at learning institutions, and less about engagement of those students. And I think we need to take a much more relational, engaging approach and less of a transactional, attendance-based approach. I certainly know that nursing is rather heavily dominated by a requirement to fulfill hours. And I think that has got some detriments in creating a very transactional approach to learning. Beyond that, I think there is a really important role in creating opportunities for community-based learning. And I think that some of Steve's work and Michael and again Elizabeth Murray's work has really been the sort of tour de force in encouraging a greater amount of community-based learning to take place. And I'm delighted to say that roughly about 18 to 20% of our curriculum is now delivered in the community. rather than in hospitals. And we're, I think, going to increase that even further. For me, another principle that I think we haven't spoken enough about is the nature of belonging. If we can't help people to understand and feel like they belong somewhere, that they belong to something and something belongs to them, then I think we will see the inevitable drift away from hard to fill areas, from local communities into the big city lights that I think are seductive but often unsatisfying for a career in healthcare. I've spoken a little bit about the role of employers, but actually I want to just elaborate on that a little bit. I don't think it's simply about creating apprenticeships. I think apprenticeships are an important route into healthcare, and we haven't done enough, in my opinion, around apprenticeships, particularly in medicine. But I think there is also something about employability. There is something about how do we encourage employers to create good jobs, meaningful jobs, valuable jobs, jobs that pay well, but more importantly, encourage learning, collaboration, reflection, and flexibility, so that life can be accommodated alongside work. And then the final comment I'd make before I close is really to think of students as adults. They're adult learners. They're not children. And yet, too often, healthcare education treats them like children. Sometimes we get obsessed with assessments and marks, and we tend to forget that there is a broader construct here about the nature of learning that is often informal, it's often hidden, and it's often happening in places that have very little to do with the formal curriculum. And yet we try to obviate or hide the learning that takes place in spaces like community shelters, like dormitories, like housing, like workplaces that are not to do with the NHS or the university environment. And we don't adequately, I think, reflect those. I was staggered by a figure that I heard the other day, which is something like 90% of medical students are now, probably now have a job outside of study, doing work to pay their way through university. And we have to start asking ourselves some fairly fundamental questions about what are we doing with our approach to higher education if we are seeing those numbers, those kinds of numbers beginning to emerge. It is much worse in some other professions. I hear about nursing students going to food banks. I hear about pharmacists struggling to find jobs, vet graduates leaving their profession within 5 years. I mean, it is a pretty challenging environment out there if you're a learner. The least we can do is treat them as adults and give them the level of respect that I think they need, so that they can start to make some decisions for themselves and create education that is more flexible and locally entrenched, locally anchored is what I mean. Ultimately, this is about how much control can we hand back to an individual to take charge of their own learning and their own journey.
One of the things about the work that I know you're doing around keeping people local and the issue of getting your employers engaged, that is a really difficult thing to do, keeping employers engaged. But also you've talked about maybe developing lifelong learning with the employers so that the students continue to be students as they move into their careers further. Is that something that sort of is relevant to the sorts of things you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think, Linda, I think if we stop to think about careers as a set of transactional episodes over the course of a lifetime, and see a career as a journey, I think we will have started to crack some of the issues associated with lifelong learning. At the moment, we seem to sort of create these divides. So there's medical school, there's foundation, there's specialty training, there's becoming a consultant, there's retirement. But actually, life is not like that, is it? Life is much more messy. It is much more convoluted. It is much more meandering, and no one's path is straight. And I think it's really important to perhaps start to say, have we yet again, in the context of trying to plan, cost, manage, and deliver, have we actually ended up losing something really valuable in the process, which is the individuality and the collective nature of the learning experience? So yes, I do agree that actually lifelong learning is really important, but actually lifelong learning pales into insignificance when we think about the pressures that we create for individuals as they seek to try and navigate their life journeys through their careers. And I think it's really far more valuable to try and iron out some of those really difficult systemic issues that have become a barrier to becoming effective at one's job and learning to work and live at the same time, which I think is one of the biggest challenges. And it is what part of the reasons why we're seeing such significant attrition from healthcare professions, not just in medicine, but in nursing, in a whole range of allied health professions as well.
I don't know if people know the Sinofin model, which has different kind of models of systems thinking, but we're in the complicated model where we sort of have experts who do command and control and kind of try to run our systems and tell our patients and stuff. And actually we are in such complex times that it's more of a model of maybe probe, sense and respond. But it's hard to move into that space so that leaders kind of work in those ways within, I think we need to think about the complex in different ways, which is where I think there's been a big growth and focus on, for example, co-creation. So we're bringing in students to help us design the learning experiences better, because they are so of a different generation in a way. Things have changed so fast that we need to do meaningful learning for, although they don't know what the end job is, looks like, neither do we anymore. And we probably need, more near peer. We need the FY1s, FY2s working and have some kind of near peer work going all the way up and down. Obviously, the work situation from when, all of us probably first started to what it is now is so much more complex and risky, with both litigation, breakdown in trust, increasing complaints. And so students are coming out into the fire. And in the meantime, with the new medical licensing assessment, they're more focused on facts and skills. And I don't know about your students, Sanjeev, but ours are more and more focused on just doing these pass test questions and not seeing patients or being on the wards, because that's what they need to do to pass the MLA. And so we're getting, for some people, they'll be able to manage the ward anyway. They'll kind of step out and they'll be okay. But for lots of students, if they don't have that experience and they don't have the growth and the understanding and the learning of the workplace, so I've probably mentioned it before, but the way I think about it is that double-stranded DNA of medical education. I think we do quite a good job of the knowing and the knowing and the doing of medicine, and which is the clinical side of the becoming clinical experts. We kind of teach that probably relatively well, and that's more in the simple or the complicated zone. But the complex zone is when we're trying to apply what we know to patients and people who have complex lives. So if we move the conversation from what is your diagnosis to how can I help you, one of them is like simple, objective, building on my science, and I can be quite sure about that, to I have to understand something of who you are to land the science with you. And I think that's whole human dimension of the and you go down the spiral into kind of curiosity, not knowing, being in uncertainty, and all of that's quite uncomfortable, particularly for learners. And I think the world is becoming more complex and uncertain. So it's how do we help and hold them to develop that human dimension of healthcare? It's not in the curriculum yet. It's not, for me, it'd be things like, or I'm looking at an ecology of the human dimension, which is around understanding ourselves, understanding the other, understanding the sociocultural space, for example, and how do we prepare them for that? How do we grow them in reflexivity or narrative humility, or about witnessing suffering, or how in trauma-informed ways, so they understand more of all of these kind of persistent physical symptoms or symptoms that don't fit into boxes, and how they relate to people's stories and narratives. So that's a sort of complex part of medicine. And we've tried different things at our medical school, and we've started talking about the human dimension at the medical school, but it doesn't immediately draw students to attend. Because if it's labelled as something that clearly isn't in the exam,
Yes.
a few interested will come. So unless you can actually really land it, well, we have quite a big problem with engagement, and we have a big problem with people even attending clinically. And I hear what you're saying, Sanjeev, about meaningful engagement, and I totally agree with you. I'm not into kind of the stick and kind of counting or getting people to sign in necessarily, but it is quite tricky. Their lives are more and more complex, and students could just quite happily sit at home the whole time and become lonely and struggle and yeah. So I think we haven't mentioned AI at all. so throw that bombshell in.
It doesn't seem to have changed very much since I was involved in interdisciplinary learning and various forms. And talking of that, we've got colleagues here from nursing. So Laura, Crystal, any other thoughts from the other professions, the health professions, and other similar issues?
The idea of training people in communities is something that I've watched throughout my career in all kinds of ways, and tracking medical students being assigned to a journey with a woman who's pregnant and following them for 9 months. I've seen that replicated actually in Nepal, which I found interesting. So I know that we can do that kind of training where you learn these relationships. And I think that we haven't taken into account the changing demographics in our communities, and that in many ways that might be best done with aging communities, where we have younger students in, say, middle school, learning how to take blood pressures and communicate about health and public health topics all the way through their early schooling, so that education and health start to knit together within a community setting, not just a medical student going back out to the community or a nursing student going out to the community, but that communities think of health as learning that is integrated all the way through. And I had the pleasure of taking part in something like that in rural North Carolina in the US with an aging project with community members across all of the disciplines, including law students, where we wrapped around a community and developed programs for all the different community members of all ages with all the different disciplines. But it took a lot of coordination to do something like that.
Yeah.
And, I currently have leadership students in nursing who are using some of the Don Berwick principles that Steve talked about in the first day. And they don't like to slow down to have to meet a patient. They are struggling in the same ways that Louise just talked about, where if it's not on the test, they don't understand why they're being asked to think about quality in this broad systems way, or how being a part of a well-being unit is pertinent to trying to build their skills and competencies. And so I think there are these challenges for all of us in all the disciplines to say, we want you to be competent clinically. We want you to learn these skills and of course, pass the test, and to have some metrics to measure that we know you're getting better, your patients are getting better. It is okay to have evidence and outcomes. But if our educational policies struggle to take into account how people get paid in the end, how the schools get paid to select students and keep those students in, and then they will build their jobs. We're chasing these numbers without building the relationships, and I can't help but think that starts before we have them in professional schools. It starts in the community, thinking that health is an all of us community kind of thing. And you see nurses and doctors mentoring, modeling, pharmacists, others, that we all care about health. We're learning together as we do that. And it's not owned by the medical school, giving us the luxury of a few moments of our time.
Really interesting, and I think nursing does have a sort of different set of rules. I put in the chat box that you're absolutely right when about the comment Sanjeev mentioned about signing off hours. Nursing is very different. You do have to have certain theory hours, certain practice hours, and even if you passed all your exams, if you haven't done the hours, you won't be able to register as a nurse. And actually our nursing and midwifery council is looking at this just now, because there are other countries that work differently towards registered nursing to registration as a nurse without the number of hours that we currently demand. But one of the things, I guess this is I haven't attended before, but I guess this is a forum to say to Sanjeev, I feel quite conflicted about the recruit locally. Because yeah, I think I can see because it goes back to one size doesn't fit all. And I guess I have to make a couple of declarations. One is that I was a dean in a university for 18, I worked in university for 18 years and I finished as a dean and had quite an overview of, we didn't have medicine, but we had nursing and a number of other professions. And the second declaration is that my son is has been through medical student as a mature student, so local would never have suited him and was never would have wanted to have stayed at home. And actually he's had great friendship group from school, but I think an 18-year-old going to university wants to explore something very different and often wants to go completely away from their home for all sorts of reasons. So it's a kind of one size doesn't fit all, I think, with that. They want a choice to move and try life somewhere else, somewhere that they haven't lived for the last 18 years. But that is, assuming an 18-year-old, which of course my son and many other students and nursing students aren't. The dropout rate, I think there are some universities who are doing much better than others, and some who are have got a much more community-oriented program, and Roehampton is one of them. I'd like to think the university that I worked was, but it wasn't. Most of the academics that I worked with came from a community background. Came from a hospital background. So the examples they were giving in the classroom were always about hospital. So that drip effect of never thinking about community in a different way of practicing was never factored into their training. As hard as I tried, I think that was one area that I did not succeed in my academic career. But as I say, there are some universities that are really addressing this now and are taking a much more community-oriented approach to nursing training and ensuring that the nurses have the nursing students have their experiences and placements in the community every year of their 3 years of training. The nursing training isn't long enough, by the way, but that's for another time.
I think it's about horses really. I think one of the issues in medicine is that we've moved so far away from the ability to fill places in some of our most deprived communities. And so attracting the medical workforce to those, I think, requires us to think afresh about what we've done over the last 20 years and what we need to do as we go forward. So I think there is an issue about, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and what does localism help with? So it isn't going to be for everywhere. If I take the Eastern region, Cambridge doesn't have a problem with recruiting medics and has no need to therefore feel the need to recruit locally. So I absolutely accept that there will be differences. But for some areas where we know that there are real challenges with recruitment into healthcare professions, I do think that actually we ought to think hard about localism and some of the systemic barriers that we have to encouraging local people, and particularly those from communities that otherwise don't come into healthcare, to think again.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev and Paul and Steve, for wonderful presentations. Sanjeev, you had some comments about the way the focus on assessments and tests in med school had such great focus. And it really sparked my sort of mind into our MMI problem that we had at University of Southern Denmark. We had a continuous amount of dropouts a while back from students who were not happy, not applying with very high grades, spend all their time in the Danish sixth form, working towards their qualification in order to apply for med school, and then ended up either dropping out or not becoming clinicians. And therefore they were seeing an odd ratio of graduates in comparison to uptake. And to try and solve this issue, that university is the only one in Denmark. The others have a second quote where you can gather points in a different system, taking up temp jobs or going traveling and volunteering. But they started a MMI, I think it's multiple mini interviews, which had more of a holistic uptake to the pupils that they hired. So they have it consists basically of this various tests that you have to do, testing different skill sets, and then you go on to sort of OSCE-like form of exams, but instead of focusing on how good are you at this particular thing, it focuses on collaboration. So that could be like build a Lego with a body stand, or there will be a communication stand where there are hired actors in to communicate quite stressful situations, or an ethical stand. I was just wondering if you had anything like it at your university, because that actually ends up being the group at our university that has the best outcome and the most clinicians graduating.
Yeah, so basically the way in which the students come in sets up the personality types that you're looking for with the skill sets that you're looking for, and flags these as being important issues for medicine right from the get-go.
Yeah, we actually ended up having, people applying because they worked so hard for grades rather than they wanted to be a doctor.
Yeah, so they were using a different set of skills to get into medicine and then
and then
subsequently
being faced with the hard work that it is, and the not so glamorous part that they were imagining it to be, and ended up dropping out, sadly.
Sure. Thank you. Sanjeev, do you do that? Do you have that kind of approach?
Most medical schools in the UK actually use mini multiple interviews for selection, and they're based upon capabilities that are actually considered important. And it's not about factual knowledge, but it's about critical thinking, it's about communication skills, it's about emotional intelligence, it's about logic. There's a whole series of different tests that can be done. That doesn't mean you have to sort of be able to examine a patient, but be able to demonstrate that you've got some of the skills that actually make a difference. And I think Catherine's right. It actually makes a difference to the type of people we select for the program, and therefore their engagement and their continuation on the program.
Yeah, which goes really to the point that Paul was saying about the sort of development going further back into education and before medical school. And thank you for that, Duke. You got your hand up, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda, and absolutely agree with what Sanjeev and others have also expressed. So I'm coming from a social care background, and as a transformation program manager, I keep seeing over my 23 years of working as a social worker and as a manager in local authorities that we've developed systems that are more transactional, that are more technical. So when we talk about a Care Act assessment, for instance, when I raise the concept, what is a Care Act assessment? Our social workers would think immediately about the system that they're using, like Mosaic or Liquid Logic. It's a CRM system where they start recording, information about their customer or their client. They forget the fact that actually that system is not visible to our residents and our customers and their clients. and in fact, what they're having is a series of conversations. They're not putting in data into a system. They're actually in practice having a series of conversations. And I think that's what we need to get back to, is about the focus on the quality of those conversations and how we can develop people who have the skills to actually engage in conversations that matter to our residents. And I think that's where the qualities around empathy, critical thinking, just what we generally call a relational practice needs to come back into the system, needs to come back into, whether it's education or whether it's the workplace, it needs to come back and it needs to center people's lived experience to help us relate better at a human level rather than, as a professional that knows everything, because we don't, because we live in a very complex world at the moment. And some of the stuff that I've added to the chat, has helped me to kind of conceptualize where we're at the moment, particularly in the council public service space. But I'm also from experience around the digitalization of health and social care. And we've already heard from our Prime Minister that they will be developing an online hospital by 2027, where people would have a choice to be referred to it. My immediate thinking is, yes, I mean, it's great, and that would be the world. And in fact, I've introduced Care Act assessments or an assessment online for residents and carers to complete. But from that 4-month launch experience, what I found is actually it's not the tool, it's how you support people to use the tool. So it's not just about, it's not just about the digital skills, the digital competencies. It's in fact the relational skills that help interpret for people where they're at. Why would you be using these digital skills? I noticed that you completed an online assessment and you completed this part of the domain around well-being. How can I help you? What does that mean? So it's about interpreting those assets that we have and then making sense of it through a conversation with our patients or residents, and being able to communicate it. And I think these are the kinds of skills, and this is the kind of work, that we will be engaging with more and more, as we proceed. And in fact, more AI, more digital would mean that these relational skills would be more important, not less important. So that's where I'm coming from. And and the other thing is to plug is that because of this, we've got together and with the Social Care Institute of Excellence to design, co-design and co-produce a relational conversations training program that will be available to our stakeholders and our staff. And I'm hoping to make it mandatory in Brent for all Brent staff who are inducted into the council. So so that's where we go.